Mandira Nayyar, and I'm interviewing senior journalist Ruhi Tewari for Tribune. For Tribune's Shelf Life, it is a place where you get to know about the latest books. And Ruhi's book is this delicious sounding title called What Women Want. So, welcome to Shelf Life, Ruhi.
Thank
And
you so much, Mandira. My pleasure.
it's a brand, I mean, it's literally really hot off the shelf. And I wanted to talk to you really about the book. It really is not Mel Gibson's version of What Women Want, but really looking at
Yes,
the,
certainly not.
actually not, right? Looking at the women voter. It is, I think for the past few elections, we always look at women being this swing vote. And Ruhi's book really looks at the women's vote, the idea of the women's vote from the past to the present and how important it has become to sort of court. So can I start off really, Ruhi, by asking you that you know, why what women want? And how do you
Right,
really look at the sort of arrival of the women's vote, as it were, which you talk about in your book?
right. So, Mandira, the interesting thing about the woman voter is that she has been such a hot topic of conversation, a burning topic of conversation for the last few elections nationally. Of course, there have been states where she has been talked about, spoken of earlier, but as a larger conversation in Indian politics, it's been what, a decade long phenomenon, I think. I would think it's 2026 almost. So, yes, from 2014. So, while she's been talked about a lot, there are many tropes around her that have been perpetuated. There are many myths around her that have been perpetuated, and I think from that's where I felt it was important to explore this issue in greater detail and write the book. So the evolution in the story of the woman voter really has been as much about numbers. I mean, we all know the story about how the gap in voter turnout between men and women has now, completely eased out, and in fact, it reversed even if marginally in 2019. But that's just one part of the story, right? The larger and the more important, more pertinent part of the story is how women as voters across the country, and I don't mean it as a generalized version, I'm saying on an average, it's obviously not absolute, have become more aware, more assertive, and more interested in going to vote. So, what has really changed in the story is the involvement of women in the voting process and in their desire to go and vote as individuals, and in the understanding of what it means to go and vote, right? So, it's no longer just a duty that they have to perform for somebody, their sarpanch, or for their husbands, or for their fathers in law, or etc., etc. It's something that they know is an instrument of assertion. And it is a way to have a conversation with the political stakeholders, who in turn are also now having a direct conversation with women. They are talking directly to women about what they need, about what issues, they need to be, what issues need to be addressed around women, about what schemes need to be given out to women. So there is a direct conversation, there's a dialogue between women as well as the political class, which is something which was missing earlier. And I think that's the real story of the evolution of women voters.
You talk about it being an instrument for assertion, really, but it's also an instrument of power. You have talked about various things. For example, you interview women who say that there is, this is, you talk about how women can distinguish between what they want at the center and what they want at the state. Um,
Yes,
you know, and I would
yes.
like you to contextualize this at this point of time when we are heading into one of the hottest elections this year, looking at Bihar. You've talked about, Nitish Kumar is someone who has wooed and courted the women's vote. He sort of owes his power in many ways to women. And in this election, this idea of the women voter is being, they're sort of being ardently pursued by both Tejasvi as well as Nitish. So, could you really talk about the discernment when it comes to women voters? Why women voters have, why do they become why are they so important in Bihar? Um, as well as, how what they want has changed over the years. So, could you really, in relation to Bihar, especially since we're going into elections, can you just talk about that?
Right. So, Mandira, Bihar is actually a very, very interesting state precisely because it was in its own way ahead of its times, right? Now we can leave aside some of the southern states, particularly, because of leaders like NTR, MGR, and Jayalalitha. Of course, there was a lot of focus and emphasis on women voters, but in 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 the larger context of India, Bihar is a state that was ahead of its time, and in a setup which was so caste ridden, which was so completely submerged in mandal politics, and where patriarchy was enmeshed in everyday life in society. The fact that women, as early on as 2006 onwards, became an important vote bank is a story in itself, and that tells you why Bihar is very important always to tell us how women are going to react in elections overall, or how their trajectory is going to be. So I'll tell you why. When Nitish Kumar came to power in 2005, he obviously knew there was an untapped vote bank in women, and it wasn't just untapped, it was a vote bank that could cut across caste, that could cut across class. So it women overall, as on an average, can be a very useful cross-cutting constituency, right? As compared to a lot of other electorates, and I think that's something he realized,
Essentially,
because
you don't have to worry about the caste and class
not
politics as
not to
much.
yes
Yeah,
not to such an
yeah,
extent. I'm not saying they're not
course.
living in
Yeah,
silos, and they're not completely devoid of these
true.
social biases and social distinctions, but obviously Nitish Kumar's case proves it, right? Because it wasn't just women from the EBC community that were voting for him, else he
Yeah,
wouldn't have come to power for so many
yeah,
terms. It's of course
yeah,
women across caste that are supporting him. He realized that very early on, and he had a very interesting, I would even go as far to say, a visionary way of looking at it, because
yeah.
he targeted the women voters from three levels, at three levels. One is through education, one is through employment, and one is through political empowerment. For education, he had his Cycle Yojana, Mukhyamantri
Mm.
Cycle Yojana, which basically was giving out cycles to school going girls. Now, one can call this a handout, but it really wasn't. It's at the end of the day, it was an enabling measure for rural girls in Bihar who earlier had no access to go to school, who had, who found it difficult to reach school. And now with this cycle, there was a new wave of empowerment that came in. And mind you, he was targeting through this voters who were not voters then. They were school going girls. So he was not directly really gaining anything from them, but he understood the power of doing this in the long run, right? For employment, he did small things like 50% reservation for women in primary school recruitment, teacher recruitment, right? Again, something thoughtful, because for women who can't go out to work, school is considered a safe space. Right,
Mm.
the primary schools would be closer to your house. There would be greater employment opportunity and greater support from your families to go and vote,
Yeah.
to go and work in these schools. So that was one thing, and the third was political empowerment. Bihar was the first state which introduced 50% reservation for women in panchayats. So 50% was going up from the 33% that was already mandated through the constitutional amendment. So clearly, Nitish Kumar saw these three areas through which he could address the gaps in women's lives, and that went on to become something which became a huge hit among women, and he became really an iconic figure for them. And of course later he went on to introduce the prohibition, which it's controversial, of course, the liquor prohibition, but at the end of the day, it was an ode to his woman voter, and he knows that it was because of her demand and her sort of reservations about the free availability of liquor that he introduced it. So he has consistently done something for women which is beyond an obvious handout. So he, in that sense, has been a visionary. Now, coming to this current election, that puts him at an obvious advantage as compared to Tejashvi, because he already comes with this huge woman support base that he's
Yeah.
cultivated over the last 2 decades now, which Tejashvi, of course, has to now start from scratch in terms of just even being able to make a dent among them. What surprises me in this election is the cash transfer scheme that Nitish has
I was going to ask you
introduced.
about that.
Yeah, so a leader who now I don't have a negative view on cash transfers. The book, I actually support cash transfers to a certain extent, because I think we sort of vilify this whole idea of handouts and freebies to women. We don't understand what it means to them and how empowering it can be. So not dissing cash transfers at all, but for a leader like Nitish, who has been a visionary and who, as I mentioned, who's thought ahead of his times, I
He sort of
really wish
notched
he
his
had thought of
constituency
the
in
what.
many ways.
Yes, yes. And I really wish he had thought of the what next instead of falling for this trope, which has now become an easy go-to for political parties, because it worked in some states. And it worked in those states because there was a thought process, because it was used cleverly, because it was implemented and executed cleverly. Now it's become, just one of those things that you introduce a few months before elections and you announce it as some sort of a freebie. And it's really become a very convenient stereotype that political parties are resorting to, and which sort of disappoints me a little bit, because I would have expected someone like Nitish Kumar to give an answer to the what next for women voters.
I'm glad you brought up cash transfers because you deal with this whole freebies aspect of women, right? You look at how that influences women's votes. Do they stick? Whether that buys loyalty and whether women actually vote only for, as you said, the beginning at in one chapter for Jayalalitha and the mixie, right? How that sort of revolutionizes kitchens and how women actually come out, and it's not really about the mixie but what it represents, right? And I would like you to sort of talk about this aspect of what is freebies and being offered as incentive versus what you talk about in the book as to the idea of women just not wanting like another gadget or something like that, but because what they want is rozgar. They want to be part of the workforce. So I would like you to talk about, and the third aspect of cash transfers. I would like you to talk about really how cash transfers become this currency really now, as you said, for just before elections, but also, what Tejasvi talks about, where he's trying to woo women by saying employment with the Jivika Didis, right? So employment, cash transfers, and freebies. Can you really talk about the distinction and how those influence women's votes and how they sort of cut across the political party spectrums?
So, Mandira, I think the interesting thing about, let's call it welfareism, right? Let's bracket it all under the umbrella of welfareism instead of freebies or cash, whatever, just for the purpose of this conversation right now. I think welfareism works with women voters as long as it fills some important essential gaps and as long as it makes their everyday lives better. The mixer grinder is one example I've taken because it's the most, it's something that is almost
Yeah,
comical, right? When people
yeah,
talk
right.
about welfareism
Yeah,
and schemes, they say mixi de diya tha.
yeah,
But it worked for women then because they didn't have this at home. A lot of
yeah,
women were struggling in the kitchen, grinding, making paste, etc. And it just revolutionized their kitchen time. It improved their lives, their everyday lives, their work in the kitchen, and hence they appreciated it. Now, after they all got mixer
obviously
grinders and after
more
they
than.
moved on, yes, yes. Oh, now, would a mixer grinder work today? No, certainly not, because they've already got it and they've moved much beyond it. So there has to be an evolution when you talk about welfareism. Similarly, why did something like Ujjwala work, right? Why did giving clean cooking fuel for the
Yeah,
kitchen work? Because um, women were struggling. They had to travel, they had to walk for miles to find firewood. They would come back with it. Then they would light a fire. They would light chulha, which was really both. It would burn their eyes. It would, they would suffer while cooking. It would take a
yeah.
lot more time. What Ujjwala did was, now forget about gaps in implementation, that's another conversation. But to a large extent, what it did was it helped women improve their lives in the kitchen. Unfortunately, women are responsible for the kitchen to a significant extent in India today. That's an unfortunate, tragic reality, but it is what it is. And it did help them improve their lives. Similarly, how did something like cash transfer, say in Madhya Pradesh, where Shivraj Singh Chauhan thought of it much earlier, much before a lot of other leaders did? Why did it work? So because women didn't have disposable income at their for themselves, and they were disadvantaged, they were marginalized. What it did was it gave women a little bit of money to do something for themselves, to do something for their children without having to ask their husbands, and to use that money to make something better and bigger for themselves. It worked because there was a thinking in that scheme about how it would be implemented. It would be given at various, it would be given every month. It would be transferred directly to the accounts of women. Before that, there was Ladli Lakshmi, which was essentially about giving a certain amount of money to women when they, when they studied to a certain extent. So that was more conditional, that your daughter has to be educated to this level for her to receive this money, and that incentivizes education for girls. So all these things work when there is some thinking and it addresses a certain gap as far as women are concerned, whether it's cash transfers, whether it's um, any of the other welfare schemes that we talk about, right? uh, Employment is the ultimate goal. That
Yeah.
is where we have to land, because that is the most sustainable, that is the most empowering of these schemes, and that is where political parties have to land. So for instance, cash transfers, I've written in my book how several women, so many women have used it to start something small.
Yeah.
Somebody uses that money to start, a tailoring boutique. Somebody uses that money to start a small vegetable vending, stall. Somebody uses that to start a small chai stall, pan stall, snack stall. I met this lady in head of the woman voter head of the Delhi elections, and she said, "Agar हमको तो सब जगह ने बोला है पैसे मिलेंगे और मुझे पैसे मिलेंगे तो मैं छोला कुलचा की स्टॉल लगाऊंगी क्योंकि मैं बहुत अच्छा खाना बनाती हूँ. मैंने प्लान ऑलरेडी कर रखा है that with that money I'll use it." So they are using it to improve their lives. See, women are not happy with freebies only because they're getting something free. They are happy as long as it helps them in their everyday lives. It helps improve their lives, the lives of their families. And that is where political parties also ultimately have to land at. And that's what they have to understand, that, just because you just a month before elections, if you say, Acha, we'll give you this, that promise doesn't mean anything to them till they see how that promise is going to improve their lives, which is why a lot of these schemes actually worked when they were introduced, not just before elections, but they were introduced soon after coming to power, whether it was Mukhyamantri Cycle Yojana by Nitish Kumar, whether it was Shivraj Singh Chauhan's Ladli Lakshmi Yojana, which he introduced soon after coming to power, or whether it was Narendra Modi's Ujjwala and the toilet scheme, which all of which were introduced soon after coming to power, so that women were able to see the results and see how it improved their lives before taking the decision to vote next. So in that sense, all of these things tie in and become important as empowering tools, as empowering instruments. But yes, employment does remain the ultimate goal, and that is Rozgar is the most basic demand that women make today, because they know that is what is going to eventually make them independent, and they need
Yeah.
Rozgar which is viable for them. They can't leave their towns and cities and go to faraway areas to work. So that has to be where we land at.
So basically, you're saying it isn't a bribe. It has to be tangibly beneficial. I wanted to
Absolutely.
ask you that,
Absolutely.
there are two things that I would like you to explain. You've looked at the evolution of the women vote, or, political parties even being aware that women are voters from the 70s, and earlier, right? So you say that, I think in 60, in 62 was the first time that gender comes into, you see vote divided in gender, right? And then you talk about the point where, for example, this about, say, Indira Gandhi, who is sort of this, who is the prime minister. And at that point of time, you say that, for example, you just addressed women, you said, bhaiyo or behno, and women remained as just that salutation, and everybody just sort of went out and addressed everything. Um, my question really is, how do you explain the fact that women were in the 50s, for example, they took part in public lives. There was a woman chief minister in Uttar Pradesh. There was Indira Gandhi, who comes in the 70s. There is the Sujita Kriplani, who is, I'm talking about, but there is this aspect of, if you look at Delhi, there is this space for women. There are very formidable women. There are 15 women who are part of the Constituent Assembly. How do you then see why there is no explanation as to why women were not considered or not wooed in many ways? They come out in public life during Gandhi. They are certainly supporters with Nehru. So why does it take an election with Indira Gandhi's assassination in 84 for people to realize that women actually are also voters? What is that shift?
Right. So, Mandira, it's essentially how times were, right? 50s was freshly independent India. There were so many challenges. 50s and 60s were all about marking the path of where India would head, the trajectory, figuring out how you would, deal with the economy, how you would deal with politics, the polity, etc., etc. So priorities for political leaders was certainly not around women at all, because the conversation was not around women at all. There was so much else that they had to focus on. There were wars. So it was a very difficult, turbulent time in that sense, because it was a time of flux, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the planning, a lot of the focus went in other directions. 70s, again, even though there was Indira Gandhi, was all about garibi hatao. There was so much conversation around
Which
poverty.
was
In fact,
called
we
worker
had this
movement,
whole
right?
idea of the Yes, exactly. And we had this whole idea of the angry young man in pop culture. It wasn't the angry young woman, because there was so much anger about unemployment, about garibi, and those became the keywords, and garib became a focus area, and women were a part of that. They were a part of that larger
Which section
constituency,
is what you're saying?
but not Yes, but not a separate constituency in that sense. In After Indira Gandhi's election, in assassination, in '84, I think what happened was that, because of course Indira Gandhi was this major cult figure and a woman, and there was a lot of sympathy among women when she was brutally killed. They came out in large numbers in sympathy and in support of Rajiv Gandhi. Uh, and that's when political parties, somewhere the seed was sown in their minds that this is a constituency, and this is a constituency we haven't looked at as an independent constituency. We have
Yeah.
subsumed it so far under Garib, under farmers, under the youth, under
Yes.
Dalits, and under so on, and under Muslims, and so on and so forth. So you have bracketed them under various other important constituencies, but never looked at as a separate constituency. And somewhere there, I think the seed was sown in the minds of the political class that this has the potential to be a standalone, unique, independent constituency in itself. And I think that sort of laid the foundation of what was to later happen.
Ask you, you look at the gamut of women voters, and I would like you to talk really about women voters like us. Essentially women who are say in Delhi or in Bombay, urban women. Um, Not necessarily women who are, who come out to vote. Of course, there is that whole aspect of, the middle
Right.
class not sort of work, sort of not going out to exercise their franchise. But how do you see that, and how do you see the evolution of that, and how do you see Nirbhay, for example, a point of reference in India in terms of women and the fact that laws change around that. How do you reference that into the idea of women vote, and how do you see the Indian woman, urban woman voter, and how do you see that, and whether she falls into the category um, of political parties, or do we not count?
No, see, obviously we count, but is the urban middle class woman being targeted directly by political parties? I'm not sure, right? I don't think that is happening. The target section are the women who have been on the margins, and perhaps rightly so, because they have been on the margins. It's a double whammy, right? The rural women have been on the margins because, one, they are women, two, they are from rural areas which anyway are disadvantaged and backward in certain ways. So I think the focus has been on women who have a certain a bigger disadvantage as compared to a lot of us in urban centers. But I will say that there is certainly a very important electorate, and it's not as if it's completely ignored. For instance, safety is not a big issue in rural areas, right?
Yeah.
Safety, safe public spaces, safe public transport, safety in movement on roads. It's not an issue in rural areas, and yet it is a big issue for political parties in many states, including Delhi or including Uttar Pradesh. That became a big thing in Uttar Pradesh because urban women demand that. Rural areas operate very differently when it comes to women and safety. That's not the conversation. Is essentially about semi-urban to urban areas. How to reduce crime against women, all these pink police booths that you see, better policing, laws, as you mentioned after the Nirbhaya episode. All these things target urban women. And the evolution, I think, there again is that earlier a lot of women would just talk about it and, say there's no point in voting and they don't talk about us and nobody thinks of us. And, it's a male, it's a completely gendered world and it's a male dominated world. But now they can see the difference because there's a conversation happening around women voters. And even if it's not directly about you, as me or you or anybody else, they say that there is a significant section of women who are being talked to, who are being involved. And that, as women, it motivates me to become more politically active, because I can see women as a whole are now being brought into the ambit of political and electoral importance. So I think that has changed somewhere. And as I said, issues related to women, even in urban areas, water, electricity, all these infrastructure is such a big issue. It's, we assume that women only talk about basic household things and immediate employment, but the number of women that talk about infrastructure today, it's amazing, because women are also stepping out to work. Women are stepping out of their homes to go and study. They are sending
So
out their children out to
see
study.
bus, for example, the aspect, whether it was in Karnataka or even in Delhi, the idea of
Delhi.
free passage is certainly.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, and this I wanted to ask because I think you know we're in Delhi. It's very it is it it has a woman chief minister. We are talking about environment, and I don't think it's only Delhi, but I think increasingly the aspect of AQI becomes an essential issue. You'll find that a lot of it becomes, the conversations are still targeted at women, or women are at the forefront of this conversation, because as you said in your book, for example, women and children, the women and child ministry, women are clubbed still with the aspect of caregiving, right? How do you think that aspect of cleaner cities, when it moves beyond just infrastructure to aspects of environment? If you see that Delhi has been very much at the heart of where you talk about, clean energy, you talk about clean cities. How do you see that impacting this thing, and how do you see that? Where do you see that ever being a sort of issue that women that will come up with elections, especially with women in the urban areas, because it's also about
Unfortunately,
safety.
Mandira, absolutely. Unfortunately, it's really not been an election issue, and that it
Yeah.
baffles me that in Delhi we talk about pollution year after year, and from October till end of November till December, we are constantly cribbing about pollution, and we're saying the state doesn't do anything, political parties are not doing anything, and when it comes to elections, it becomes the least important issue. When you travel on the ground ahead of elections in Delhi, whether it's this year or the one, the 2020 elections or 2015, people talk about infrastructure, people talk about employment, crime, etc., etc. And now people are talking a lot about the Yamuna, how dirty the Yamuna is. But nobody really mentions pollution as a topmost issue, because I think when these elections happen, pollution is over, right? So I think it just goes out of your mind and it no longer remains as much of a conversational point um, for anybody. Forget about just women, for men or for women. So far, I haven't seen it as being a very pertinent issue as far as elections are concerned. And uh, that's exactly why political parties also get away with doing nothing about it, because they know it's not going to bring a government down. It's not an issue that's going to make you lose an election. It's not an issue like inflation, for instance, on which governments fall, on which you lose power. They have realized that this issue is very much a living room conversation issue and doesn't really enter the polling booth. And I think that's why they take advantage of that situation and do nothing substantive to address it year after year. Going forward, with women becoming more vocal, women becoming more assertive, women becoming more important as voters, yes, the hope is that women would be at the forefront of raising it, because, as you said, it's the children who are affected the most, right? The most vulnerable sections are children, and children are being affected the most by pollution. And that's something that really, I think, is an important issue for women. So going forward, there is hope that it is taken up in some substantive way. But, I think for this issue to be taken up as a very important issue and to rally people around it, it requires an intelligent politician to tap into it and to make it a political agenda, and then use the power of the woman vote bank to sort of help spread conversation around the issue and make it an election issue.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for being part of Chef Life, Ruhi, and all the best. And I
Thank you
think
so much. Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you very much, Mandira. Thanks.